Tantor Audio presents Lost Legacy by Annette Dashofy. Narrated by Romy Nordlinger. 1. Zoe Chambers' teeth chattered in response to the rush of adrenaline, never mind the 90-degree heat of June in southwestern Pennsylvania. She flipped on the siren as the ambulance approached an intersection along the tarred and chipped country road. "Geez, I hate these kinds of calls," her partner Earl muttered. He cut the wheel hard, making the sharp left onto Ridge Road. The medic unit swayed and jounced over the ruts. Me too. Zoe shifted in the passenger seat and studied the incident report in her lap. Farm accident. Caller reports victim may be DOA. In rural Vance Township, nearly every summer produced one of these. A year ago, a tractor rolled over, pinning the driver. Another time, a farmer was run over by a hay wagon. Before that, someone lost an arm in a piece of machinery. The possibilities were endless. None of them were pretty. But even more than the type of call, the address on the report contributed to her unease. Threatening gray clouds loomed in an otherwise pale blue sky. Not a hint of a breeze disturbed the tall grasses stretching across the field. "It's gonna rain," she said. Earl grunted a response. They topped a hill and a picturesque farm lay before them. That's it. She clenched her jaw to quell the chattering. Once she got to work on the task at hand, the jitters would stop. At least, they usually did. A 2-story farmhouse with a sagging porch faced the road like a sentinel to an ancient barn. The doors, large enough to easily accommodate massive farm machinery, stood open in a wide yawn. Outside, 2 tractors hitched to wagons, stacked high with fresh-cut baled hay, waited. Their patient was inside. Zoe had put up enough hay to know that was the only reason loaded hay wagons would be sitting idle with a storm approaching. She picked up the mic. "Control, this is Medic 2. We are on scene." 10-4, Medic 2, came the response, followed by the time. 17:32. Earl parked the ambulance behind one of the hay wagons. When Zoe swung open the door, a wave of hot air slammed into her. It was thick with humidity and perfumed with the scent of freshly cut fields. She offered up a silent prayer. Please don't let the patient be up in the hayloft. If it was 90 degrees outside, it would be at least 120 up there. She tugged on a Monongahela County EMS ball cap and grabbed the jump kit from the patient compartment. A pair of young men sat in the grass several yards away. Their sun-bronzed arms contrasted sharply with the pallor of their faces. A third, his back to them, stood doubled over, heaving. Another group of stoic but ashen helpers gathered in the shade of a silver maple, smoking cigarettes with unsteady hands. An older man stepped down from his perch on one of the tractors, flicked away the butt of a cigarette, and approached the paramedics. "What the hell took you so long?" His voice sounded as rough as his weather-beaten face. Without waiting for a response, he added, "He's in here," and directed them toward the barn. As they moved closer to the structure, the sweet smell of mown hay gave way to the stench of rotting flesh. At the gaping doorway, Zoe fought back a gag reflex. Her nose told her what was inside before her eyes grew accustomed to the dark interior. The body hung in the center of the barn from a rope looped over a rusty pulley high in the rafters. The other end of the rope was tied to an upright support beam. Nearby, a wooden ladder leaned at an awkward angle, reaching toward the loft. The sickening buzz of ravenous flies filled the barn. Earl pressed a handkerchief to his mouth and nose. "Nothing for us to do here." He shot a glance at Zoe. "Or at least nothing for me, Miss Deputy Coroner. I'm going to radio it in and request the cops." Zoe gave a nod. At least pronouncing this one wouldn't require checking for vitals or unpacking the portable EKG. There was no question he was dead. That much was obvious. Now the questions were how long and, the big ones, cause and manner. The sight of a body hanging in that barn did nothing to quash the apprehension she'd been experiencing since she'd first heard the address. She'd grown up hearing stories about this place, and about another hanging. The farmer watched Earl retreat to the ambulance before turning to Zoe.
"Where's he going? What did he mean about requesting the cops? The old man's dead. Cut him down and get him out of here so I can unload this hay."
She blinked, but clearing her eyes didn't change what she'd heard. Was he really that callous? "Who are you?"
"Name's Carl Loomis."
"You know the victim?"
"Yeah, it's Jim Ingle."
Carl motioned toward the house.
"Jim owns this farm. I've been putting up the hay for him since he's been sick."
Jim Ingle? James Ingle. Zoe looked down at the thick layer of dust on the rough-hewn floor. Several clear boot prints marred the surface. Did anyone go inside the barn? Loomis blanched.
"Hell no. I opened the doors so we could pull the wagons in, and there he was. Half my boys tossed their cookies when the smell hit 'em."
Without stepping inside, Zoe leaned forward and squinted at the body. Ingle's face was pale gray, and his tongue protruded between his lips. Milky, opaque eyes stared, unseeing, at the hay stacked on the opposite side of the barn. Zoe doubted she'd have recognized him if she'd met him on the street. But that name, she knew the name. She'd seen enough. The stench and the buzz of the flies drove her farther outside, gasping for air. The farmer was eyeing the sky. The ominous dark clouds had all but obliterated the blue. A breeze kicked up, hissing through the maple trees surrounding the house.
"So, how about getting him down and out of here? I really need to get moving if I want to keep this here hay dry."
"I'm afraid we can't just cut him down." Loomis leaned closer until the odor of tobacco smoke on his breath made her wince.
"Why not? I know it stinks, but—"
"Not because of the smell. This is a crime scene. The police will need to investigate."
"Crime scene? Ugh," he laughed. "This ain't no crime scene. Jim's been threatening to end it all for weeks. Hell, months. The man was dying of lung cancer. Said he wanted to go out on his own terms. Well, God bless him, he did. The only crime being committed here is you keeping me from getting my hay in this here barn before the rain ruins it."
Earl jogged up to them.
"The cops are on their way. Franklin Marshall, too."
He nudged Zoe with his elbow.
"You lucked out. The boss himself will be here to process the body."
Darn. Zoe made no effort to hide her sarcasm. When she'd taken on the deputy coroner role, she'd expected to investigate homicides and mysterious deaths, solve puzzles and make sense of the senseless. Television made it seem so exciting, but the reality was more like this, calling the time of death on a poor, cancer-riddled old man who opted to take his own life rather than waste away any further.
"Franklin Marshall? The coroner?"
The farmer clenched his fists as if he wanted to slug both of the paramedics.
"Process the body? Are you people friggin' nuts? Jim farmed this land for almost 50 years. He'd be the first one to tell you we need to get this hay inside before it gets soaked."
"Then he should have picked a better place to kill himself," Earl said. The farmer's eyes bulged, and Zoe feared he might take a swing at her partner. She placed a hand on Earl's arm and was about to suggest he cool it when she spotted an SUV with emergency lights flashing, cresting the hill and roaring toward them. "The police are here," she said. To Carl Loomis, she added, "You might want to locate another barn, or maybe tarp the wagons, but an unattended death like this will have to be investigated. Until the coroner gives a ruling of suicide, the police will treat it as a homicide." The farmer gave no indication of hearing the last part.
"Another barn? Look around, missy."
Spittle flew from his lips.
"There ain't another barn for more'n 2 miles.
He scowled.
"Jim might have some tarps in there, though."
Loomis made a move for the door, but Zoe stepped in front of him. "You can't go inside."
"Then how do you expect me to tarp my goddamn wagons?"
he continued with a stream of cursing that threatened to singe her ears. The Vance Township police vehicle rolled to a stop next to the ambulance. The chief of the department stepped out, tall and striking with his salt-and-pepper hair and piercing blue eyes. Zoe's pleasure at seeing Pete Adams extended far beyond mere relief. She trusted his commanding presence would calm the irate farmer. She resisted the urge to give Pete a wide smile, embarrassed by her own infatuation with the man. They'd been dancing around their mutual attraction since last winter, neither brave enough to take things further, considering their equally lousy romantic histories.
"What do we have?"
he said as he approached. Zoe caught the slightest hint of a grin cast her way, and her face warmed. She opened her mouth to give an official status report, but Loomis cut her off, offering his personal take on the situation, concluding with,
"I need to get these 2 wagon loads of hay inside before it rains, so can you folks please cut 'em down and get 'em out of here? No disrespect intended."
Pete eyed Zoe, his eyebrow raised in a question. She shrugged. "I advised Mr. Loomis that we have to treat this as a crime scene, but—"
"I keep telling you it ain't no crime scene."
Loomis's face had blossomed into a shade of red that made Zoe fear he might explode, or at least have a stroke. A second Vance Township police vehicle rolled into the driveway. Pete tipped his head toward the barn.
"Well, Mr. Loomis, why don't you tell me exactly how you found Mr. Ingle?"
He pointed a finger at Officer Seth Metzger, who was climbing out of the township cruiser.
"Call dispatch and get Kevin and any of the part-time guys that are available out here, and request County and the crime unit. We're going to need the help. Then start getting statements from all these guys."
Pete motioned to the farm workers, who still hadn't regained their color. He turned a fuming Carl Loomis to the barn entrance. Zoe blew out a sigh, glad someone else was now the focus of the farmer's rants. Not that she didn't understand his concerns. She suspected more than one farmer in the area was frantically trying to get his hay in right about now. No trace of blue sky remained. The wind was kicking up dust devils in the driveway, and the air was so thick, if she could grab a chunk and squeeze, she was sure moisture would pour from it like a saturated sponge. Alone for the moment with her partner, she caught his arm and drew him away. "Do you know anything about the Ingle family?"
Earl shrugged. "Just that they've lived in the area and owned this farm forever."
No. She studied the house. One of the shutters appeared ready to drop to the ground. A broken upstairs window had been replaced with a sheet of plywood, and no way would she trust the rickety steps to the front porch to hold a person's weight. "I haven't owned this farm forever. Don't you remember hearing the stories about this place?"
"Stories? What stories?"
She motioned to the barn where Carl Loomis flung his arms in animated outrage as Pete calmly jotted notes.
"James Ingle isn't the first person to hang in that barn."
In all Pete's years with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, he'd never faced anything like Carl Loomis. The man was livid, not because a friend was dead, but because 2 wagon loads of hay were on the verge of getting soaked. Of course, being a city cop transplanted to the role of police chief in rural Vance Township meant he didn't know shit about things like wet hay. Thunder rumbled, sending Loomis closer to the edge of hysteria.
"You don't understand,"
he said, for the 4th or 5th time.
"I can get better than $5 a bale for this hay, but not if it gets wet. Do you know what that adds up to?"
Pete sympathized, but the coroner and the county crime unit hadn't arrived yet. He had to keep everyone away from the body.
"What about covering it?" "That's what that girl said. I don't exactly have a tarp in my hip pocket, and she wouldn't let me in the barn to look for one."
Pete spotted Zoe deep in conversation with her partner, so she'd already attempted to solve Loomis's problem. Naturally, she'd grown up in Vance Township and lived on a farm. She'd know better than he what this guy was going through. Pete looked for Metzger. The young officer was speaking with a group of Loomis's workers who milled around one of the wagons.
"Seth?" he called.
"Yeah, Chief?"
"Pull the tarps out of the vehicles. You and those boys get busy covering the wagons."
"Yes, sir." Lightning cut across the sky. In mere seconds, thunder rumbled. Loomis's rage subsided. He glanced at the sky.
"I need to go help my boys."
Pete waved the appeased farmer away and watched the road for the coroner and the team from county as the men made short work of covering the hay. The first large raindrops plinked on the tin roof, forcing Pete to step inside the reeking barn. He stared up at what remained of Jim Ingle. What would it take to drive someone to end his life in such a gruesome manner? Loomis said the man was dying of cancer. Surely he'd had access to drugs. Morphine. A simple overdose had to be a more preferable form of suicide than hanging. Unless it hadn't been a suicide. Pete? He swung around to find Zoe standing in the rain at the barn entrance. Wisps of her short blonde curls fringed her EMS ball cap. "Franklin just pulled in," she said. She held a pair of latex gloves, wringing them like an old washcloth. "Thanks." She didn't move, but caught her lower lip in her teeth. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know for sure." She paused, took a glance at the body, and wrinkled her nose. "Do you know the history of this barn?" "No." From the look on Zoe's face, he suspected it must be relevant. "I'm not sure of all the details, but I remember hearing stories when I was a kid. My mom's family once owned this farm. There was some hoopla about 2 of her uncles being found dead here, in this barn. One was hanged. I can't remember about the other, but I do remember my mom despised the Ingle brothers, including James Ingle." Zoe tipped her head toward the corpse. Okay, so this particular history lesson sparked Pete's interest. And why did she despise the Ingles? Zoe glanced over her shoulder at Monongahela County Coroner Franklin Marshall, who was lugging a large duffel bag toward them. "Because," she said to Pete, lowering her voice, "Mom believed James Ingle was responsible for the deaths." 2. "What have we got?" The clipboard Franklin held over his head served as a poor substitute for an umbrella against the wind-blown rain. Pete wondered the same thing. He stepped back just far enough into the barn to allow Zoe and Franklin shelter without disturbing the footprints in the dirt, and motioned to the body hanging from the rafters. "I'll get my camera and shoot some photos." Pete shouted over the roar of the downpour on the tin roof. "Then you can tell me." "Do you guys need my help?" Zoe asked, as 4 more police cruisers crested the hill and rolled toward the farm. "I don't believe so," the coroner said. "Looks like we have plenty of manpower on the way. You and Earl can go back to saving the living." Pete dashed through the deluge with her to their vehicles and motioned for her to get into the passenger seat of his SUV. He removed his cap and mopped his face with a handkerchief. "What else do you know about those other deaths?" "Not much." Zoe panted from the run. "It was an old family lore sort of story. There's probably nothing to it, but I thought I'd mention it." "Aren't your mom and stepdad coming to visit soon?" She rolled her eyes. "Soon, yeah. I have to pick them up at the airport tomorrow morning. First time they've been back from Florida in years. I can hardly wait." Pete chuckled at her sarcastic tone. "I bet. Maybe you could ask her about those old homicides. Find out what happened." "Do you think there's a connection?" "How long ago did all this take place?" "I don't know. Way before I was born." He gazed through the fogged windshield at the barn. That would make the cold case more than 35 years old, if it even was a case. "I doubt Jim Ingle's death has anything to do with your great-uncle's. But you know how I hate coincidences." "Yeah. I'll ask Mom when I see her." Zoe reached for the door handle. Pete caught her arm. "You coming to the poker game tomorrow night?" She gave him a devious grin. "I'll be there. After spending the day with Mom and Tom, I'll need to get away." She dove from the SUV and rushed around it to the medic unit. Pete watched her climb into the ambulance. The paramedic uniform with its lumpy cargo pants and gadget belt did a good job of camouflaging her figure, but his imagination stripped away the obstacles. He'd wanted to ask her out a half-dozen times since the mess with her ex-boyfriend last winter, but he always thought better of it, reluctantly. She kept stressing how much she valued their friendship. Friendship? What stirred in him at the moment sure didn't bear that particular label. At least they still saw each other socially for the weekly card game whenever she wasn't on duty. Someone pounded on his window, jarring Pete out of his fantasy regarding Zoe's sans uniform. He made out the form of County Detective Wayne Beranek through the rain-streaked glass. Pete powered the window open, and a dripping Beranek rested his arms against the door.
"Hey, Pete."
The young hotshot presented his usual broad smile.
"Think it'll rain?"
Pete grunted. Smart ass.
"You getting the photographs?"
"Yep." Pete reached into the back seat of the SUV and retrieved his evidence collection kit, including his digital camera. He hit the button to close the window, forcing Beranek to jerk his arms out of the way. Stifling a smile, Pete climbed out. Beranek fell into step beside him as they jogged to the barn. Lightning sizzled across the sky, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet.
"Holy shit,"
Beranek said, diving the last few feet into the barn. Pete bit back a laugh and set his bag on the dusty floor.
"What do you think, Franklin?" Beranek asked. "Suicide?"
The coroner jotted notes on a pad.
"You know I'm not going to make any declaration until after the autopsy."
"The farmer who found the body thinks so," Pete told Beranek. "Says the old man had lung cancer and had been threatening to kill himself for a while." Beranek gazed out through the rain.
"Is that the victim's house?"
"Yep."
"Anyone else live with him?"
"Not according to Carl Loomis. Ingalls' wife passed away 5 years ago. His brother lives about a mile north of here." Pete dug his camera from the bag and thumbed it on.
"Has the brother been notified?"
Beranek asked.
"Not yet."
Pete lifted the camera to his eye and snapped a wide-angled shot of the barn with the victim hanging in the center.
"Okay."
Beranek cleared his throat.
"You document the scene. I'm going to check out the house. Maybe we'll get lucky and this poor sap left us a clear and concise suicide note."
Pete silently rolled the slim odds of that happening around in his head.
"When you're done with the pictures," Beranek continued, "my guys can take over processing the barn and help Franklin with the body. Then you and I can pay a visit to the other Mr. Ingle."
Pete placed a ruler on the floor next to one of the footprints to indicate scale and focused the camera. He knew Beranek hated to call on the next of kin as much as he did, but if Jim Ingall's death turned out to be a homicide, family members would also be their prime suspects. By the time Pete and Beranek stepped onto Wilford Ingall's front porch, the storm had blown past and the skies were clearing. Carl Loomis had informed Pete that the victim's brother was in his mid-70s, but the man who opened the door appeared old beyond time. His flesh was so pale, Pete guessed it hadn't felt the sun within the last decade. Ironic that the brother hanging in the barn looked to be the healthier of the two.
"Wilford Ingle?"
Pete said.
"Yeah."
The old man squinted at Pete in his uniform. Beranek held up his badge.
"May we come in?"
"No." Pete studied Ingle. With the rain gone, both the heat and humidity were on the rise. In spite of it, Ingle wore a long-sleeved cotton shirt from which bony wrists and hands protruded. Stained denim coveralls made for a much heavier man hung on his frail frame, but the man's dark eyes suggested steel forged by years of hard work and hard living. Wilford Ingle took no bull from anyone. Ever.
"Sir?"
Pete softened his voice.
"We're here about your brother."
Ingle blinked.
"My brother? Jim?"
"I'm sorry to have to tell you, Mr. Ingle," Beranek said,
"but your brother is dead."
Ingle's shoulders shifted downward, as did his gaze.
"Well, that's it then. I knew it was coming. Just thought we had a little more time is all. Thank you, officers, for letting me know."
He stepped back, his hand on the door, ready to close it. Pete blocked the door open with his foot. "I'm afraid Detective Beranek didn't make himself clear. Your brother didn't die of natural causes." Ingle stiffened.
"He didn't?"
"No, sir.
His body was found this afternoon hanging in his barn."
Ingle's face might have lost its color, if it had had any. The old man's knees buckled, and he slammed sideways into the door jamb. Pete grabbed for him, but the awkward angle threw Pete off balance. His foot caught on an uneven board, and his ankle rolled as Ingle dragged both of them to the porch floor. Pete on the bottom. For a bag of bones, the old guy was damned heavy.
"Mr. Ingle, are you all right?"
Veronica knelt beside them. Ingle moaned.
"Yeah,"
he squirmed, grinding a sharp elbow into Pete's sternum.
"Help me up, God damn it!"
Veronica grabbed an arm and Pete pushed from underneath. Groaning, the old man struggled to his feet, but not before stepping on the ankle Pete had twisted. He bit back a yelp of his own and hoisted himself up as Veronica helped Ingle into the house. The old man shuffled to a faded, battered sofa and flopped onto it.
"I'm sorry about that."
He rubbed the shoulder that had impacted against the door jamb.
"I take these spells."
Pete's ankle screamed when he put weight on it, but he gritted his teeth against the pain.
"We need to ask you a few questions." "I guess I got a few of my own," Ingle said. "You sure it was my brother?"
"Carl Loomis gave us a preliminary identification," Pete said.
"What?"
Veronica jumped in.
"Preliminary. The coroner will confirm the ID with dental records or fingerprints, but Mr. Loomis was certain it was him." "Well, Carl would know."
Ingle frowned at his hands in his lap.
"Hanged, you say?"
"Yes, sir." Veronica pulled his notebook from his shirt pocket.
"I searched your brother's house."
Ingle's eyes darkened.
"You had no right."
"I found his suicide letter." Ingle choked.
"You what?"
"Found a letter. It was handwritten lying on the kitchen table." The old man shifted on the sofa. His mouth worked as though forming words, but no sound came until he said,
"I don't believe it. Where is this letter? I want to see it."
"I'm sorry, it's evidence."
"Evidence?"
Ingle's voice went up an octave.
"Can't you tell me what it said?"
"Yes, sir, I copied it word for word." Veronica looked down at his notes and read, "I've done things in my life I'm not proud of. Now the good Lord is punishing me with this disease. I deserve every excruciating minute of torture it brings. But I pray my death will offer some light to the darkness. Forgive me. This is the only way. Goodbye, brother." Ingle's hands trembled.
"I can't believe he went and done it."
"Excuse me?" Veronica said. Ingle's eyes narrowed on the detective.
"I want you to stay out of my brother's house."
"We can't do that." Pete straightened, ignoring the flames licking his ankle. "Until the coroner tells us otherwise, we consider his house a crime scene." The old man glared at him and gave a grunt. "When was the last time you saw your brother?" Pete asked.
"What's today? Friday? Must have been, Tuesday. I drove him to a doctor's appointment in Brunswick."
"And what doctor was that?"
"Dr. Weinstein in the old National Trust Bank building on Main Street."
"Mind telling us what the doctor said?" Veronica asked.
"He said Jim was dying. What the blazes do you think he said?"
Ingle pulled a bandana from his hip pocket.
"Moron,"
he muttered into the fabric before blowing his nose. "Did your brother give you any hint he intended to commit suicide?" The old man grew pensive and leaned back, sinking into the sofa.
"Yes."
Ingle's gaze shifted to the window.
"I didn't believe he'd really do it, though."
"Is it possible that someone killed your brother and made it look like suicide?" The old man sputtered.
"Are you out of your mind? Who would go to the trouble to kill a man who's only got a couple of weeks to live? No one, that's who. Moron."
Pete cleared his throat. He'd have preferred to be armed with more information before questioning the old farmer, but he wanted to see the man's reaction. There's something else I'd like to know about. Ingle gave an exasperated sigh. I've been told your brother wasn't the first.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?